So some of the information that will be presenting today comes out of a report that was published by the National Academies of Science, Medicine, and Engineering and published by the National Academies Press just a couple of years ago. And it was a fairly important report. It was titled Minority Serving Institutions, America's Underutilized Resource for Strengthening the STEM Workforce. And like many other reports that have been put out around STEM and national needs, this report emphasized the fact that we're at a point right now where the nation will need 1 million more STEM professionals than it is on track to produce in the coming decade. So just to meet the needs of our country, we need to really up the numbers of STEM degrees and professionals that we're producing. So click. Because if we don't do this, then we risk the inability not just to meet the nation's technological needs, but we also risk reduced global competitiveness. So we are at an age where technology and information are currency, and so we need to keep up. Next slide. The report also emphasized that there are a couple of key underutilized resources that can help us address this issue of needing to produce more degrees. The first of these is that there's 20 million young people of color, and these are within the age range of 15 to 24 years, in the US, whose representation in the STEM educational pathways falls well below their proportion in the general population. So we have the bodies, we have young people, we have college enrollees, we have people who go to college and graduate, but their proportion within the STEM pipeline is relatively low. And so if we were able to recruit and retain and just engage that excitement and participation, that would help us meet that deficit of the 1 million degrees. Click. And the bottom line from the report was that the educational outcomes and STEM readiness of this particular subgroup, these young people of color, will actually have direct implications, not just for STEM, but in terms of the country's growth, in terms of our national security, and also in terms of our prosperity. So this really is an imperative. How do we leverage this resource of these young people in order to meet these needs that have been identified? Next slide. The other underutilized resource that was identified in this report were minority serving institutions. Now, most of us have heard of minority serving institutions, and they have been created in one of two ways. First, there are specific schools that historically were designated to serve specific populations. And this category included historically Black colleges and universities, which were meant to serve African-American students, and tribal colleges and universities, again, also targeting a specific group, in this case, Native Americans. But a second type of MSI emerged over time, and this is really a category that derives from their proportional enrollment of students of color. That has traditionally been set at 25%. So if your school, even if it wasn't historically designated to serve a particular group, but if they enroll, for example, 25% Hispanic or Latino students within their population, then that gets the designation of HSI. And we also have Native American, Asian American, Pacific Islander designations based on percentage of the school. For a long time, the number of MSIs was relatively stable, but as you can imagine, because of the demographic pipeline of our country, these numbers have increased dramatically. So we now have 700 minority serving institutions in the US. These include both two-year community college institutions as well as four-year institutions. And this is something that people don't naturally know or think about. And that is that across these 700 MSIs, they enroll 5 million students. And that constitutes just about 30% of all the undergraduates in higher ed. So that is a big chunk of students to enroll. And so this is a set of institutions that really stands to make an impact on the production of college-educated students, on the production of people that will contribute to their communities and to the nation at large. So this is a relatively large population. Next. We also should note that it's important to understand what the relationship is between MSIs and STEM. And what we know, looking at the numbers, again from this report, are that undergraduates enrolled in STEM fields at 4-year MSIs actually outnumber their counterparts at 4-year non-MSIs. So there are more undergraduates enrolled in STEM within these minority serving institutions than there are at 4-year non-minority serving institutions. And when we looked at production together, the HBCUs, the HSIs, and the Asian American and Native American Pacific Islander serving institutions actually produce 20% of the nation's STEM bachelor's degrees. So MSIs are heavily invested, heavily involved, heavily impacting our STEM production, our STEM capacity in this country. Along with understanding their role in STEM, we also have to think about what are the attributes of these minority serving institutions. How do they differ from primarily white institutions? Because if we understand those differences, then our ability to partner with them, I think, is eased somewhat because we are fully cognizant of constraints or opportunities. And so it's important to understand who we're reaching when we decide to partner with minority serving institutions. And some of you might already know this, but in fact, minority serving institutions enroll greater percentages of first generation, low income, and ethnic racial minority students. This also means often that these students are coming in with less academic preparation than are students that go to traditional or primarily white institutions. So that can be a concern and oftentimes leads to certain stereotypes, but I'll come back to that in a moment. Minority serving institutions also have lower expenditures per student, excuse me. So they operate in a condition of under-resourcing. Even so, they are very strong engines of economic mobility. So if you look at the changes in economic prosperity for students who go to MSIs and you compare what income level or strata they're coming from in terms of their family of origin versus where they end up post-college, that disparity is much greater, higher impact on this economic mobility than a similar comparison when you look at the production of primarily white institutions and how they have an impact on their student outcomes. Furthermore, often teaching, mentoring is built into the fabric of minority serving institutions. And it is said that they provide students of color with stronger academic experiences because they're very student-centered in that way, and more supportive cultural environments than do primarily white institutions. And what we've heard from primarily white institutions, especially in STEM, is that it can be a very isolating environment, not just for students of color, but for women and other minoritized populations. And then when you look at intersectional categories, for example, women of color, there is in fact a lot of attrition because they don't see role models they look like themselves. The culture may be different, the forms of communication may be alienating, and they don't feel comfortable being the only person in the class, et cetera. So these are some of the differences or considerations that we take into account when we're thinking about characteristics of MSIs. Next. In addition, we also know that MSIs generally have more diverse faculty and leadership. And so I think this contributes to the sense of a more supportive environment because there seems to be a greater understanding around what those issues are and the importance to address issues of isolation and reduced academic preparation of the students. I mentioned earlier, they do have an institutional mission to serve students, and this holds true both on the organizational culture, how they set things up, what services they provide, but also on institutional outcomes. So the way that they retain students and graduate them to the point of success. MSIs award a disproportionate share of degrees to minority students in fields such as education and engineering. So they are successful in getting students through. And this is a positive thing on the part of MSIs. On the flip side of being disadvantaged, they get a very tiny proportion of federal funding. And so if we look at the amount of money that was allocated, for example, and this is from 2015, by the top 5 federal agencies, and this is money directed specifically to STEM programming in higher education, MSIs ended up getting only 2.5% of that 30.5 billion. So compare that, or contrast that, I should say, to the percentage of students enrolled, 30% to 2.5% of funding that they bring in. Now, what are the implications of these differences across MSIs and PWIs in terms of collaboration? So I'll quickly give you some ideas there. Let's go to the next slide. And first of all, should you choose to collaborate across these different institutions, for those who are at a PWI, it does give you the opportunity to work with what will likely be a more diverse set of faculty, of students, and of staff. But as importantly, this is a group of persons who have proven success in producing a greater percentage of STEM professionals than one would expect. It's also important to recognize, and this holds in both directions, if you're an MSI working with a partner at a PWI or the reverse of that, that there is differential access to resources. And this holds whether you're talking about the specific discipline, engineering, for example, such that PWIs probably have better equipped labs, newer equipment, more of it, and so space, et cetera, but also in terms of institutional support. So PWIs are very successful, for example, at drawing in large grants because they often have a setup where they have development officers, where they have research officers, and the infrastructure is set up in such a way that it facilitates that type of activity. It's encouraged and so forth. But it's not just the setup institutionally, it's also in terms of the time and effort that one can devote to STEM activity. So the work expectations, as you might know, are different, and MSIs professors usually have higher teaching loads. When I've looked at PWIs versus MSIs, for example, PWI faculty are teaching maybe 1 course per semester. In some instances, they might teach 2 courses one semester and 1 course the other semester, but often that's reduced by grant support. In comparison, for minority serving institutions, the teaching load can be as much as 3 courses per semester. And in some instances, it is greater than that. So the amount of time that one can devote to research is limited. Okay. But these collaborations that we've been talking about from Wednesday and then continuing through today are not strictly about research. There are instructional opportunities, there are mentoring, there's speaker series, there's exchanges. And so these should not in any way be problematic simply because of the higher teaching load expectation. And then the last point I want to make here is that, in fact, there are many opportunities associated with these collaborations. Obviously, a diverse workforce is increasingly a priority for funding agencies, and they have put out calls for proposals that specifically emphasize the need to diversify the workforce, the pipeline, but they are also expecting collaborations across these different types of institutions. And in more recent iterations of these calls, the collaborations are expected to be substantive and meaningful. It's not simply the case that PWIs can call on MSIs to provide students for summer programs or to indicate that they have some collaboration with an institution that has a diverse faculty. And as we heard from Mo yesterday, it's no longer acceptable to simply delegate the MSI or relegate it to a smaller portion on some grant, or to be brought in at the last minute with very little clarity in terms of what that partnership will look like. So these are all important considerations when we're wanting to launch these partnerships. I'm now going to turn attention to how we might think about crafting these partnerships, and then we're going to move into looking at a tool, really just a template for the questions to ask and the discussions to have And that's where we'll actually do some interaction with one another and see what questions emerge or what dimensions you think are not being addressed. So let's go to the next slide here. And so basic steps in crafting partnerships. What are the areas? How can you identify the areas of interest to you? What are you interested in collaborating on? And so this is the first thing. And so you also then want to identify other people at other institutions who are also interested in collaborating in these areas of interest. Secondly, and we talked about this quite a bit last time, is you want to make connections that are authentic. You want to establish rapport. And this goes beyond just what's your name and this is my area of interest. Talk a little bit about individuating information relevant to yourself. What are your hobbies? You know, we mentioned last time, what do you like to do when you go to a professional conference and have free time? What do you go look for in that town, or what do you explore, et cetera, et cetera. And although these seem like little steps to take in terms of sharing this personal information, it turns out that there's a vast body of research in the social psychological realm, which suggests that when we get tidbits of details about an individual who is of a different category, whether it's based on gender or race or socioeconomic status or international versus domestic status, when we get those tidbits of additional individuating information, it's far less likely that you will then simply invoke stereotypic thinking and simply treat this person as a member of a category with homogeneity associated with that category. So one of the things that we can readily do to try and dispel bias and to try and reduce categorical thinking about others is really exchange information on a personal level. And this causes individuation rather than this distancing of recognizing somebody primarily as a member of a category. So connecting authentically is really important. Then, obviously, it's important to discuss what the joint interests are between the collaborators. You know, what domains are you interested in exploring? What activities have you thought about would contribute to this work? What activities have you tried out? And why is this work important to you? Is it something that's being driven by some extrinsic motivation, or is this something at the core of who you are? So at this point in the process, in crafting of the partnership, you really want to elucidate what your goals are. So I'll stop there for just a minute and ask if there's any questions here, or if anybody has examples of either taking this approach or instead rushing straight to the task and feeling like the communication is a bit off or something is missing in the partnership. And again, if there are no examples, that's fine, but anybody who wants to contribute, please do so. I think we were at number 3, discuss joint interests and why they're important to you. And the significance here plays a role because it begins to show you what the values are of your collaborator and whether you have values that are common. So I think that helps move the conversation along. Number 4, identify resources, and these include both individual and institutional resources. So what are your strengths as an individual? What contributions will you bring to bear to this partnership? Do you have a skill set? Do you have experience in this arena? How will that facilitate the partnership and potential success? But it's also important to identify resources that are financial or human. Are there other staff that can be facilitate this effort? Are there grants? Is there seed money? Do some of you have access to departmental resources? Where can you get support? You know, what units do you belong to? What organizations? What program officers do you know at funding agencies that might be able to give you advice on this? And what are the real constraints? Everybody faces budgetary issues. And so what is it that you're working with? What are you going to come up against? Finally, not finally, but then you also have to engage cross-institutional challenges. Are there policies around personnel, again, around space, around just creating memorandums of understanding? intellectual property. If you're applying for a grant, how do the indirect cost rates differ? And is that going to be an issue for you? Will you have to use a subcontracting mechanism, et cetera? So things that may come up in that arena. And then there's facilitating tools. And so here, I'm thinking of, are there organizations like the Inclusive Engineering Consortium that can serve as a hub for networking, that can connect people across these different types of institutions? Is there training that we can provide to help facilitate partnerships? Are there ways in which we can disseminate the work that you're doing and use it to serve as a role model for other people who are considering partnerships? And then the only other thing I would add here is really an area that's missing from this list, but should be, I think, on the larger document, is collaborative engagement. And this kind of points back to what we were talking about just a few minutes ago, but really was the focus of the earlier session. And that is, how do you establish regular communication patterns? How do you create that psychological trust? How do you identify mutual benefits to all parties involved? So in terms of outcomes, co-authorship, credit for the work, et cetera, but also in terms of accountability. How are you able to communicate around accountability, and how do you implement accountability if it becomes an issue?